Greetings and salutations, everyone. My name is Andrew Kirchhoff, and welcome to my YouTube channel. Today, I'm talking about 6 must-start players for Week 1 of the 2023 fantasy football season. Now, like I said earlier this week, we want to start our studs, and that's exactly what we're going to do. But you guys know, on a given weekly basis, I always want to try to find variables in fantasy football that could lead to advantages. Variables such as matchups, variables such as injuries. I mean, again, Cooper Kupp and Christian Watson being out this week will certainly lead to more target opportunity for other prospects within those offenses. Now, other variables such as weather isn't really talked about much in fantasy football, but going into week 1, weather is certainly going to play an impact in the overall successes or potential failures of our prospects. So we want to keep that in mind and mention that as we talk about these 6 must-start players going into week 1. Now, before we get into today's content, a reminder, all the statistics that I mentioned over the course of today's video regarding these prospects are for a half PPR scoring format, meaning everyone in the middle, whether you do play in a standard league or a full PPR league. There are timestamps down in the description of the video, so for those of you who are looking for a specific player, you can find it down there. Thank you very much. While you're down there, if you're new to the channel, again, be sure to subscribe. We're making daily fantasy football content for the entirety of the season for the singular purpose of trying to help you guys win a fantasy football championship. So whether it's content such as this, must-start players, weekly rankings at all 4 primary positions, live streams. I'll be live streaming tomorrow afternoon, 1 p.m. Pacific Standard Time, and Sunday morning, 8 a.m. to 10 a.m. Pacific Standard Time. Kickoff with Kirchhoff. You can join us as I'll be answering all questions that are out there. And of course, we'll have updated rankings on screen, again, for the sole purpose of trying to help you guys win a fantasy football championship. Now, for those of you who want additional content from the channel, you can go ahead, travel down to the description of the video, and check out Underdog Fantasy. At this current moment in time, if you sign up using code Andrew and make a first-time deposit minimum of $10, not only are you going to get a first-time deposit match up to $100, you're going to get my weekly rankings every single Sunday morning from weeks 1 through 18. Those rankings consist of by position, by tier, quarterback, running back, wide receiver, tight end, kicker, and defense. Includes flex rankings, half PPR, full PPR. Again, I never really talk about flex rankings or full PPR on the channel, so if you guys want advantages in regards to those overall rankings every single Sunday morning, weeks 1 through 18, be sure to sign up via Underdog Fantasy. Use code Andrew. For those of you who are wondering if you're eligible to help me help you over the course of the entirety of the 2023 season, based on the map to the right side of the screen, should determine your eligibility. Take advantage of the opportunity. Thank you very much for supporting. All right, let's get into talking about some must-start prospects for week 1. We begin with J.K. Dobbins. He has a really advantageous matchup. We all know that. I mentioned it earlier this week when I talked about my running back rankings, but J.K. Dobbins taking on the Houston Texans should be a walk in the park. Primarily, when you look at the overall pro football focused run-stopping grades of the Houston Texans, the current personnel, not last season's team, the current personnel going into 2023, they have the 7th worst defense as a whole, including secondary members, which includes safeties and cornerbacks, 7th worst amongst all teams. And if you just isolate the front 7 in terms of linebackers and defensive line on their base front, they have the 6th worst run blocking grade amongst all teams in the National Football League. This should be an easy matchup for the Baltimore Ravens rushing attack, especially when you take into account the Houston Texans last season were giving up the most fantasy points to opposing running backs last season in terms of running back rushing statistics isolated. So when we just isolate running back rushing yards and rushing touchdowns, they were giving up 21.95 fantasy points per game to opposing running backs. On top of the fact that this defense, even though that they have new personnel, a new head coach, which is a defensive-minded head coach in D'Amico Ryans, when you bring in guys like Jimmy Ward to play safety, well, unfortunately this week he may not even be playing as he missed multiple practices already this week. If you're starting safeties out, that's not great. But 2 of their 3 starting linebackers have been on the injury report this week. If those guys end up missing this game, it's only going to be an even bigger advantage for someone like J.K. Dobbins. I mean, the Baltimore Ravens are already considered 10-point favorites going into this matchup. So when you take into account the advantage that they have and the fact that this is a run-first team in the past, I understand that Todd Monken is the new offensive coordinator, and they've gone from Greg Roman to Todd Monken, which should be a huge shift in terms of the overall opportunities that they give to their running backs in comparison to passing the ball. But Todd Monken, formerly an offensive coordinator of the Cleveland Browns in 2019, in that given season, they ran the ball with their running backs the 11th most times amongst all teams in the National Football League, and they gave their running backs the 12th most opportunities. So that's a combination of rushing attempts and targets within a given year. They're going to get J.K. Dobbins heavily involved. Considering the fact that this is another season that he is separated from that ACL injury, he's fully healthy. And the last time we saw him, despite the fact that he wasn't fully healthy in 2022 from weeks 14 through the NFL playoffs, in those 5 games, this man was dominating, having 15 average touches per game, 13 fantasy points per game and a 6.56 yard per carry average. The only reason his overall fantasy point per game average wasn't more was because he only scored 1 touchdown in those 5 total games, despite how hyper efficient he was in those opportunities. In every single one of those games, given 12 or more rushing attempts, while Gus Edwards certainly took the back seat, and that's exactly what it's going to look like going into week 1 in an advantageous matchup. Now, when I brought in the scope in regards to the variables for J.K. Dobbins that he should be taking advantage of this week besides matchup, weather is another point of conversation. Going into the game, there's a 78% chance of rain. Quote unquote, definite rain showers is what I read. So if that's going to be the case, and this is not only going to be an advantage in terms of running the ball because the other team cannot stop the run, you may be forced to run the ball even more because of the fact that it is a rain-heavy game. And in those overall opportunities, J.K. Dobbins should get more rushing attempts, and with more rushing attempts, will lead to more fantasy yards. As of this current moment in time via Underdog Fantasy, his current number is 59.5 rushing yards. I expect that number to continue to crawl up over the course of this week, but that's definitely a number I'm going higher on going into this week. All right, let's move on to the next prospect I want to mention. It is Tyler Higbee of the Los Angeles Rams. Like I mentioned earlier, when we talk about variables in fantasy football that could lead to success and more target opportunity for our prospects, Cooper Kupp not being in the lineup for week 1 certainly plays a factor. I mean, who doesn't think that Tyler Higbee isn't going to be funneled or peppered with targets? I mean, quite frankly, not only is he going to be the most veteran receiving option on that team, when we just look at the overall receiving core of the Los Angeles Rams, outside of Tyler Higbee, okay, sure, we have Van Jefferson, Tutu Atwell, still very inexperienced, Puka Nacua, which is a rookie wide receiver. There really isn't much for Matthew Stafford to throw the ball to. So we expect Tyler Higbee to be highly utilized. If you go back to last season, weeks 1 through 5 of the season, Tyler Higbee was averaging 9.1 fantasy points per game while averaging 9.6 targets per game. The volume that he was getting in terms of targets was incredible, and even though he wasn't able to find the end zone in those games, in a half PPR, full PPR, certainly had a lot of value because of the overall opportunities he was given. Now, this upcoming week, they take on the Seattle Seahawks. It is a division rival, and like I mentioned yesterday, in regards to my tight end rankings episode, I have Tyler Higbee pretty high up there, primarily because last season, the Seattle Seahawks, they were giving up 11.71 fantasy points per game to opposing tight ends last season, which was top 5 in terms of the worst defenses against opposing tight ends. It is an opportunity we want to take advantage of, especially considering last season in the games in which Cooper Kupp was not active and was not healthy. We saw a guy like Tyler Higbee be targeted on 27% of the routes that he was running. When we see Tyler Higbee on the field for the entirety of the game, probably 80+% of the offensive snaps, and the reason primarily why is because the Los Angeles Rams run more 11 personnel than any other team in the National Football League. In fact, in their offensive formations, they have one tight end at very least in 99% of their overall snaps from 2022. So Tyler Higbee is going to be on the field. He's going to be running a lot of routes. He's going to see himself a far greater target share than he typically does. And especially when we take into account last season from weeks 10 through 18 without Cooper Kupp, despite the fact that there wasn't Matthew Stafford in majority of those games, he was still getting himself 6.5 targets per game, 4.5 receptions, 8.3 fantasy points per game with quarterbacks like Baker Mayfield and John Wolford. I mean, those are not Matthew Stafford, and you'll certainly see the difference going into this week's matchup. As we have the healthiest that the Rams offense and defense is going to be, they'll definitely play the Seattle Seahawks tough. And hopefully Matthew Stafford will be looking in the direction of Tyler Higbee more than I even anticipate, which will lead to even more success for fantasy purposes. All right, let's move on and let's talk about the other side of this matchup. Of course, we have the Rams taking on the Seahawks. And the player I wanted to talk about in regards to the Seahawks is Tyler Lockett. Tyler Lockett, I don't know why, is just continuously slept on. I understand that JSN, Jackson Smith-Njigba, has a very good opportunity of playing this week. But like I've said all offseason, I truly don't believe that is going to play a huge impact on the overall contribution as to what Tyler Lockett provides in terms of fantasy purposes. When we look at his overall performances last season against the Los Angeles Rams defense, in week 13, 9 catches on 12 targets, 128 through the air, 1 receiving touchdown, and 23.3 fantasy points. In week 18, 7 targets, 4 catches, 54 receiving yards, 1 receiving touchdown, 13.4 fantasy points. Last season, within this offense, throughout the regular season, the 16 games he played, averaged 12.21 fantasy points per game. So in comparison to the rest of the regular season, he found himself a lot of success against the Rams secondary. And going into this upcoming weekend's matchup, there's a huge difference as to what he faced last year in comparison to what he'll face this season. Specifically, the cornerbacks have completely changed. You no longer have guys like Troy Hill and Jalen Ramsey, who were the top cornerbacks of the Los Angeles Rams secondary and at times played well last season. But despite that even being the case, the Rams still gave up the 10th most points to opposing wide receivers last season in a half PPR scoring format, which was 27.44 fantasy points per week on average. Now you go ahead and you remove Jalen Ramsey and Troy Hill. You replace them with Ahkello Witherspoon, who will probably be covering DK Metcalf. He did not play well last season, and quite frankly, DK Metcalf is a handful, probably double covered. And we'll probably see Darion Kendrick try to cover Tyler Lockett. And when I say try to cover, the primary reason that is the case is because amongst all Rams cornerbacks last season, Darion Kendrick was the lowest graded in terms of overall coverage. On top of it, amongst all cornerbacks in the National Football League last year who played at least 300 snaps of coverage, he was the lowest graded overall cornerback and was allowing 14.6 yards per reception last season. I honestly think this is a recipe for success for Geno Smith, Tyler Lockett, and the fact that DK Metcalf is obviously on the other side of the field pulling so much pressure. We know we're going to see a healthy backfield. Kenneth Walker was pretty much absolved of his overall injury designation. So going into this week at full power, the Seattle Seahawks, specifically Tyler Lockett, should find a lot of success. All right, we move on to Brian Robinson Jr. Now, this is another one of those incredible matchups. They take on the Arizona Cardinals, and for the remainder of this season, we're going to try to take advantage of playing our prospects against the Arizona Cardinals in every opportunity we have. So whether it's Terry McLaurin or Jahan Dotson this week, we're obviously starting those players, but we want to go ahead and give a little bit more light to the potential of what Brian Robinson is capable of based on the current matchup. Now, when you take the Pro Football Focus run-stopping grades of 2022 and you apply them to the 2023 defense of the Arizona Cardinals, as a full defense including cornerbacks, they are the worst run-stop defense in terms of overall grades going into this year. If you take just their front seven base, linebackers, and defensive line, they're also the worst in the National Football League in terms of run-stopping grades. This is going to be a one-sided affair. There's a reason why the Washington Commanders going into this weekend's matchup are 7-point favorites. Now, currently on Underdog Fantasy, the number that they have Brian Robinson set at is 57.5 rushing yards. He's been able to accomplish that number in 8 out of the last 12 games he's played. Additionally, he's been able to surpass 12-plus rushing attempts in 10 out of the last 12 games he's played. And mainly, if you want to see him surpass that number of 59.5 rushing yards, typically you just have to give him more snaps. In his career last year, as a rookie season, obviously came off the IR. When he was given opportunities of playing 47% of the offensive snaps or more, in 6 out of those 6 games was able to easily crush the number of 57.5 rushing yards. Additionally, in those games in which he played 47% of the snaps or more, was averaging 12.75 fantasy points per game. And in terms of the record of the Washington Commanders, when you allow Brian Robinson to play that many snaps, they were 4 wins, 1 loss, and 1 tie. So in contests where they're typically winning and they want to kill the clock in the second half, they give a lot of opportunities to a guy like Brian Robinson. Last year, averaging 10.4 fantasy points per game when he had 10 touches in a game minimum. In my opinion, we're going to be in a very advantageous position against the defense that really isn't equipped in terms of stopping the run. And additionally, they have Josh Dobbs as their starting quarterback. They literally just traded for Josh Dobbs a couple weeks ago. And I understand that he's going to be the starter and he's comfortable with the playbook, considering the current offensive coordinator of the Arizona Cardinals used to be his offensive coordinator of the past when they were with Cleveland together. But that all being taken into account, I still believe this is going to be a one-sided affair. This defense for the Washington Commanders are going to force a lot of turnovers. There's a reason why I have them as a top 2 ranked defense going into the week. If you haven't picked them up, please do yourself a favor. And on top of it, the additional variable besides the advantage of the matchup, this is going to be another one of these rain games. There's a 73% chance of rain. The quotation was likely rain showers. If in fact that's going to be the case and we're going to see rain in Washington, I'm expecting this team to run the ball even more going into this upcoming Sunday's matchup. All right, let's move on to another running back that I like a lot this weekend. It is Khalil Herbert going into week 1, taking on the Green Bay Packers. Again, like I mentioned earlier this week, in the 2 matchups in which he had an opportunity of taking on the Green Bay Packers last season, he was outshined by the fact that David Montgomery was the lead back. Montgomery dominated touches and snaps just like he did last night. But in the matchups in which we saw Khalil Herbert get himself at least some sort of opportunity against Green Bay, 7 rushing attempts for 59 rushing yards and 8.4 yard per carry average. Now, in those games when David Montgomery was the starter, David Montgomery found himself a lot of success. 15 carries, 122, 14.6 fantasy points in the week 2 matchup. In week 13, put up 14.7 fantasy points, was able to find the end zone in this overall matchup. But as a whole, 15 rushing attempts, 14 rushing attempts, had himself a sprinkle of a couple targets in both those games. If you give all of that workload an opportunity, designate that to Khalil Herbert as the clear RB1 of this team, the sky's the limit. I mean, you go back to 2021 when Khalil Herbert was in fact the starting running back of this team when David Montgomery was out due to injury, and he took on the Green Bay Packers in that contest, 19 rushing attempts, 97 rushing yards, a rushing touchdown, 3 targets, 2 receptions, 15 receiving yards, and 18.2 fantasy points. I truly do believe with a full workload of opportunity within an offense that is highly improved this offseason and has one of the best run blocking offensive lines in the National Football League, going up against a defense that quite frankly is one of the worst in terms of stopping the run. Based on their current Pro Football Focus run stopping grades from 2022 going into 2023, as a full defense, this is the 6th worst defense in terms of stopping the run. And as a front 7, defensive linemen and linebackers, they're the 4th worst in terms of stopping the run based on their grades. This is a defense that gave up the 7th most fantasy points per game to opposing running backs based on rushing isolated statistics alone, allowing an average of 15.91 fantasy points per game. The fact that Khalil Herbert is being slept on is quite surprising. I understand that Justin Fields is a part of this offense, but they're certainly going to have to run the ball. And when you have a mobile quarterback like Justin Fields, it changes the entire math of a defense. It often forces backside defensive ends in these read option schemes to have to wait, because if he's not responsible for someone like Justin Fields, then you have to designate an outside linebacker to wait there for Justin Fields. It purely just makes it that much more advantageous for running backs to have a mobile quarterback in the overall running game. I think Khalil Herbert, in my mind, based on the opportunity, based on the matchup, should be in a great spot. All right, let's talk about the final prospect. Now, this is a player that at this current moment in time, I will objectively say this is more of a, hey, you should go pick up Jonathan Mingo rather than you should 100% start him. If you're playing in a super deep league, I understand that there's a potential which you could end up starting him, but this is the logic and the thought process. DJ Chark is out this week. Terrace Marshall Jr. is dealing with a back injury. He's been designated and limited to practice all week long. And Adam Thielen missed Thursday's practice. So even if Adam Thielen and Terrace Marshall are active, we're still going to see Jonathan Mingo be a starting wide receiver within this offense, because when we go to the preseason, he played 28 of the total 32 offensive snaps with the first team with Bryce Young, while Thielen and Hayden Hurst played 29 of those overall snaps. So we know that Jonathan Mingo, based on the depth chart, based on how much he played in the preseason, he's a starter. With no DJ Chark, vying for targets, that opens up more and more opportunity against the Atlanta Falcons this upcoming weekend. The Atlanta Falcons, who will be missing their number 2 cornerback, Jeff Okudah, going into the matchup. There is going to be opportunity for Jonathan Mingo, rookie wide receiver, a guy that is 6'2", ran a 4.4 640, and is currently only rostered in 17% of Yahoo leagues, to be the number 1 target of this offense, especially if you have a hobbled Adam Thielen and a hobbled, Terrace Marshall. Who else is going to get targets besides him and perhaps, Miles Sanders out of the backfield and Hayden Hurst? This could be a commentary in regards to Hayden Hurst, because the Atlanta Falcons, quite frankly, gave up a fair share of fantasy points to opposing tight ends on a per weekly basis last season. But I think this is more of an endorsement of, hey, we should be looking at Jonathan Mingo as someone that we should pick up, put on our rosters, and just get ready for him to potentially ball out and hopefully maintain the starting job within this offense going forward. Again, this is a defense that last season, they gave up their fair share of points to opposing wide receivers. They, in fact, gave up the 11th most to opposing wide receivers last season, 27.36 fantasy points per game in a half PPR scoring format. I think this is just a great opportunity to snag Jonathan Mingo before it's too late. All right, that's going to cover it in regards to my 6 must-start players for week 1. We're going to now transition into talking about some potential pick'em slips that I'll be building for week 1 of the 2023 fantasy football season via Underdog Fantasy. For those of you who are interested in tailing in regards to some of these pick'em slips going into week 1, again, be sure to go down to the description of the video, use code Andrew, and sign up via Underdog Fantasy. Make that first time deposit, because not only are you going to get the first time deposit match, which you can utilize, but you can also get my 2023 fantasy football rankings every single Sunday morning from weeks 1 through 18, sent from my email directly to yours, so you can have advantages for the entire season. So let's talk about some of the players that we already mentioned on today's episode in regards to must-start players. It's funny enough that J.K. Dobbins' overall rushing yard total went up a yard while I was recording this video. I'm still going, it went from 59.5 to 60.5. I'm still 100% in on going higher on that overall total, primarily because he was able to accomplish that in 4 out of the last 5 games in last season's overall efforts from weeks 14 through the NFL playoffs. The only week in which he wasn't able to surpass that is because he totaled 59 rushing yards. Again, he's really close to, surpassing on every single one of those weeks. It's a rain game. It's against Houston. I'm expecting, of course, a lot of utilization from someone like J.K. Dobbins. Now, when we scroll down and we talk about the potential of Brian Robinson, I think Brian Robinson is in a very similar situation in the idea that, yeah, he's probably going to get himself a lot of utilization. Therefore, he's probably going to be able to crush this number. When we look back at last season, 57.5 rushing yards. When he played 47% of the offensive snaps, he was able to surpass that number in 6 out of his 6 games last season. This should be a game in which we should see at least 50% of the offensive snaps go in the direction of Brian Robinson Jr. because they're going to be leading for majority of this contest against the Arizona Cardinals, and they will be running the ball for majority of this game. I'm going higher on that number. Now, let's talk about another running back, Khalil Herbert. Again, his current number is at 48.5 rushing yards in his career. In all the games in which he has had himself 13 or more touches, he's been able to accumulate 72, 100, 157, 97, 77, 75, 92, and 62 rushing yards. Khalil Herbert should not only be able to dominate this number, he should crush 48.5 rushing yards, especially against the Green Bay Packers run-stopping defense, which is awful. We move on to someone like Tyler Higbee. I'm going higher on his overall receiving yard total. You know, in comparison to when I was prepping for this video, his number in terms of receiving yards went up 2 whole yards. I was going to say that in the first 5 games of the 2022 season, where he was getting littered with targets, he was able to surpass 44.5 receiving yards in 4 out of those 5 games. Again, I'm still all in on the idea that Tyler Higbee is going to be highly utilized within this offense going into this week because of the absence of Cooper Kupp, so I'm going higher regardless. And the final prospect, of course, because Jonathan Mingo is not on the available list, we're going to go with Tyler Lockett. His current numbers are quite interesting. The reason why it's at 4.5 receptions and 56.5 receiving yards is because in Week 18's contest against the Los Angeles Rams, he had 4 receptions and 54 receiving yards. The expectation is, oh, he's not capable of surpassing those numbers because he didn't the last time. This should be a very advantageous opportunity on hand, considering the cornerback difference from last season to this season. And of course, Tyler Lockett starting off the season strong within this offense. He was able to surpass both 56.5 receiving yards and 4.5 receptions in 10 out of his 16 games last season, which is a 63% success rate. So I'll go ahead. I'll take the higher in terms of his overall receiving yards going into this week. And I'll go ahead and put that pick'em slip together and send that through. That's 5 players for a 20x potential. Should be fun. Yes, confirm. Boom. All right, the entry is there. I know it's a little bit smaller on your screen because I'm trying to zoom in. Now let's go ahead and let's talk about some players outside of these must-start prospects going into week 1. Now, as of right now, via Underdog Fantasy, you have the opportunity of taking advantage, or at least I have the opportunity of taking advantage of Saquon Barkley, 0.5 total yards. That's an automatic hire. You can put that together with any pick'em slip going into this weekend's game. Of course, that's the Sunday Night Football game against the Dallas Cowboys. Of course, they have Deion Sanders' son for the quarterback of the Colorado Buffalo. He will be taking on Nebraska. The expectation is that he'll probably be able to surpass 2.5 passing touchdowns. Take advantage of these, put together some pick'em slips. But a couple players that I found that were quite interesting going into this week that I was like, you know what? We might want to take advantage of them. Number 1 is Joe Mixon. Joe Mixon at 19.5 receiving yards. In my mind, that is an automatic hire. The primary reason because of this has to do with the fact that last season, of course, besides the fact that Joe Mixon was setting career highs in terms of receptions and targets, he really was getting a lot of utilization in the receiving game. He was able to surpass 19.5 receiving yards in 10 of his 14 contests last year. You no longer have Samaje Perine in this backfield, which is only going to open up more opportunities in terms of the receiving game. But the reason why it's such a low number, 19.5 receiving yards, is because in the Week 14 contest against the Cleveland Browns, he only had 2 targets, 2 catches, and 10 receiving yards. Again, this should be a game in which should be highly competitive. And with Joe Burrow dealing with that calf injury, he'll be less mobile. He'll have to check it down. In which last season, again, he was targeting Joe Mixon about 5.7 times per game. If Joe Mixon's able to haul in his normal 4.5, receptions on average per game, get himself 4 receptions, I think 19.5 receiving yards is easily going to be crushed in this overall number. Now, another player that's within this same matchup, running back specifically, I like Nick Chubb going higher on his overall fantasy point total. Again, I don't know why Nick Chubb is sitting at 13.75 in a half PPR scoring format. He's a top-tier running back. We know that. Now, I mentioned this in context earlier this week in regards to his overall performances against the Cleveland Browns in the last couple seasons. In the last 3 years, since Kevin Stefanski has been the head coach and play caller of this offense, since he took over the job. In the first game of the year in which the Cleveland Browns take on the Cincinnati Bengals, regardless of which week it is, but at least the first matchup in which they take each other on within a given season, Nick Chubb has put up 24.9, 29.3, and 25.8. In those first matchup, the Cincinnati Bengals, they're just slow to start. Their defense is not equipped to be able to stop them. And Nick Chubb in those games had a base minimum of 100 rushing yards and 2 rushing touchdowns in each game. I think less than 14 fantasy points for someone like Nick Chubb is just blasphemous. There should be a very competitive matchup between these two teams. I'm expecting Nick Chubb to play well. Now, another player in regards to total fantasy points that I really liked, I'm going to go ahead and scroll past a lot of players. If you end up finding something, and you were like, Andrew, you skipped over it and you really need to go ahead and pick higher or lower on that going into this week, be sure to let me know down in the comment section. But I really like the idea of going higher on Justin Jefferson's fantasy points. 15.95. The number one overall pick in fantasy football should never even be considered someone that could put up that volume of points, especially in such an advantageous matchup. Like I mentioned multiple times this week already, Kevin O'Connell, former offensive coordinator of the Rams, in the 3 games in which they took on Todd Bowles and the Tampa Bay Buccaneers defense, they threw for 340 passing yards minimum in each contest, and Cooper Kupp in those games, 11 catches, 145, 9 catches, 96 and 2 touchdowns, 9 catches, 183 and a touchdown. Justin Jefferson is the Cooper Kupp of this offense, and I am 100% expecting success. Justin Jefferson in his career, specifically even last year, when he gets 10 or more targets, is averaging 23.88 fantasy points per game. This is an automatic higher for me going into this week. Now, as we continue to scroll down, there are other players that I like. The one that I found quite intriguing was the potential of Bijan Robinson and his overall rushing attempt total. In fact, his rushing attempt total went down one in the recording of this video, primarily because I'm assuming there's been Cordero Patterson news that has been made available. I'm expecting 14.5 rushing attempts to easily be accessible. Bijan Robinson should be the primary main back of this team and could very easily get himself 15 rushing attempts. Last season, when Desmond Ridder was the starting quarterback of this team, they were giving their running backs 31 rushing attempts per game on average. In the 2 games last season in which this offensive coordinator and head coach took on the Carolina Panthers, they ran the ball with their running backs 22 times in one game and 30 in the other. There's going to be a lot of concerted effort to running the ball and giving their new weapon, Bijan Robinson, a lot of opportunity. I think 14.5 rushing attempts is very much so a capable number for him to surpass. Another player that I liked in regards to this list is Jamal Williams. Now, we just got to scroll all the way down till we find him. Jamal Williams, as of this current moment in time, you know, I was actually going to talk about his rushing attempt total. Because there's no Alvin Kamara and Kendre Miller, the expectation is that he should be able to go higher on this overall rushing attempt total. Regardless of the fact that it's a difficult matchup, he should get a bunch of opportunity. Unfortunately, it's kind of grayed out because I think they may be readjusting the line. So when you're watching this video, if this number is still there, 14.5, I'm taking that higher. As of this current video, obviously it's not available, but I'm taking that higher going into this weekend. Of course, another one of these matchups that I really like and specific players is Tua, of course, helping Jalen Waddle find success. His current number is at 65.5 receiving yards. It's gone up 1 yard since the recording of this video. He's been able to surpass that number in 10 out of the last 12 games that he played with Tua in 2022, excluding the Cincinnati Bengals game in which, of course, Tua got hit in the head and obviously that injury was sustained. But in the other 10 out of those 12 games, he's been able to surpass 65.5 receiving yards. I'm expecting Jalen Waddle to absolutely be able to crush that number going into this week. We'll pick higher on that. We'll keep it rolling. That's already 5 players. But if, in fact, you want another couple players, the other ones that I'm looking at going into this week are other wide receivers. Specifically, CeeDee Lamb is sitting at 12.95. That is a ridiculously low number. CeeDee Lamb has been able to crush that number in 10 out of the last 13 games he has played with Dak Prescott, including the playoffs last season. He's taking on cornerbacks that are rookies. Should be an easy number to crush. And the other player that I was looking forward to is the Monday night game, Garrett Wilson. 5.5 receptions is really low. I would expect the number 1 receiving target of Aaron Rodgers and an Aaron Rodgers-led offense to get more than 5.5 receptions. I think he could very easily find himself with 6. Unfortunately, I can't put him together into this slip because I already have hit my max capacity. But either way, we'll go ahead and put together the players that I mentioned before. That's going to cover it for us today. Thank you, everybody, for watching. Again, if you want to take advantage of the current pick'ems via Underdog Fantasy, you can travel down to the description, use code Andrew. Not only get the first-time deposit match, get my 2023 fantasy football rankings every single Sunday morning from weeks 1 through 18. All you got to do is, again, sign up using code Andrew, make that first-time deposit, minimum of $10, take advantage of the opportunity. And like I was showing before, there are some potential free pick'ems that you can make. Saquon Barkley, 0.5 total yards. Take advantage of that for Sunday Night Football. Put it together for a slip this upcoming weekend. Thank you, everybody, for watching. Until tomorrow, again, we'll be live streaming at 1 p.m. Pacific Standard Time. I'll see you guys. Peace.